He was 6'9" tall. He had an IQ of 145, higher than most doctors and lawyers, and by the time he was 15 years old, he had already killed 2 people with his bare hands. His name was Ed Kemper. The press would later call him the co-ed killer, but before the world knew that name, he was just a boy that even his own mother was scared of. This is not a movie. This is not a dramatization. Every single detail in this story is pulled from real police records, real court testimony, and real interviews Kemper gave to the FBI himself. This actually happened. Before we go further, drop in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now for you. I read every single one, and if stories like this real crime, explained through real psychology, are something you want more of, hit subscribe now, because this channel is going to keep bringing you cases the world needs to actually understand, not just be scared of. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Ed Kemper became, you have to understand what happened to him first. This isn't an excuse, it's an explanation, and there's a big difference. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born in 1948 in Burbank, California. On the outside, it looked like a normal American family. On the inside, it was falling apart. His parents fought constantly. His father eventually left, and his mother, Clarnell, was left to raise 3 kids alone. She was smart, sharp-tongued, and deeply unhappy, and a lot of that unhappiness landed on young Ed. Clarnell would later admit she was harsh with her son. She often told him he would grow up to be just like his father, as an insult. As Ed grew taller and bigger than other boys his age, she reportedly grew more afraid of him and more controlling. At one point, she made him sleep in the locked basement, alone, away from his sisters, because she said she didn't trust him not to hurt them. Picture that for a second. A young child, isolated in a dark basement, night after night, told, without being told directly, that he was dangerous, that he didn't belong with the rest of the family. Kids don't process rejection logically, they absorb it, and what Ed Kemper absorbed was this: I am not safe to be around, I am the problem. Even as a young child, Ed showed behavior that, looking back, were massive red flags. He reportedly killed the family cats more than once. He would play disturbing games with his sisters, like pretending to be executed in a gas chamber. He was fascinated by death, weapons, and violence in a way that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. This is actually something forensic psychologists pay close attention to. There's a known pattern sometimes called the homicidal triad: animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting past a certain age, that can show up in the childhoods of some future violent offenders. Not every kid who does these things grows up to hurt people, but when they show up together, alongside severe emotional neglect, it's considered a serious warning sign. Ed Kemper had almost all of them. By age 10, things at home had gotten so difficult that Ed was sent to live with his paternal grandparents on their ranch in North Fork, California. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a quiet, kind man, but his grandmother, Maud, was strict, and by most accounts, she treated Ed the way his mother had, with control, criticism, and little warmth. Ed later said he felt just as isolated there as he had at home. He was a teenage boy with a genius-level IQ, trapped on an isolated ranch, being managed rather than understood by the 2 adults responsible for him. On August 27, 1964, everything changed. Ed was 15 years old. That day, he took a rifle and shot his grandmother in the head while she sat at the kitchen table. When his grandfather came home, Ed shot him too, in the driveway. Then he called his mother and told her what he'd done. She told him to call the police. He did. When police arrived and asked him why he did it, 15-year-old Ed Kemper gave an answer that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said he wanted to know what it would feel like to kill his grandmother. Some reports say he initially claimed he shot her because she wouldn't let him shoot birds outside, and then killed his grandfather, so he wouldn't have to explain what he'd done to her. He was evaluated by psychiatrists and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a diagnosis that would later be debated and revisited by different professionals over the years. He was sent not to a juvenile facility, but to a Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security institution for the criminally insane. He was the youngest patient there. Here's the part that most true crime content skips over, but it's the most important part from a psychological standpoint. Ed Kemper was smart enough to know exactly how disturbing his actions were. He wasn't confused about right and wrong. What he lacked was empathy, emotional attachment, and because of years of degradation and isolation, any real sense of connection to the people who were supposed to love him. This is a pattern psychologists see again and again in cases like this. It is rarely just a kid who was born evil. It is almost always a combination of biology, environment, and repeated psychological injury, compounding over years until something breaks. At Atascadero, ironically, Ed Kemper thrived in some ways. He was intelligent and cooperative. He worked closely with psychiatrists, actually helping to administer psychological tests to other patients. Staff described him as polite, well-spoken, and easy to talk to, which is exactly what made what happened next so terrifying. Because in 1969, against strong warnings from at least one of his own psychiatrists, Ed Kemper was released, and he went right back to living with the one person whose approval he had never been able to earn, his mother. What happened next would turn Santa Cruz, California, into one of the most dangerous places in America, and almost no one would know it until it was far too late. By the time Ed came home in 1969, his mother Clarnell had remarried and moved to Santa Cruz, where she worked at the University of California campus. Ed moved in with her, and the two fell almost immediately back into old patterns. Clarnell was verbally abusive, controlling, and constantly reminded him of his past. Neighbors and family members later described screaming arguments that could be heard through the walls. Ed, now in his early 20s, stood at 6 feet 9 inches and weighed close to 300 pounds. He got a job. He enrolled briefly in community college, hoping to become a psychologist himself, which, given everything he'd been through, makes a strange kind of sense. He wanted to understand what was wrong with people. Possibly, on some level, what was wrong with himself. He even worked for a time with the California Department of Transportation, which required him to have his juvenile records sealed and reviewed, and despite his history, he was cleared. But underneath the surface, something darker was building. In the early 1970s, hitchhiking was extremely common, especially around college campuses like UC Santa Cruz. Female students would routinely hitchhike to save time or money, trusting that strangers offering rides were, for the most part, harmless. Ed Kemper began picking up young female hitchhikers, driving them around, and at first simply talking to them, then dropping them off safely. He did this dozens of times without incident. Investigators later believed this was a kind of rehearsal. He was studying his own impulses, testing how far he could push himself, learning what it would take to act on the darker thoughts that had never fully gone away. On May 7, 1972, that testing phase ended. Ed picked up two 18-year-old Fresno State students, Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lut, who were hitchhiking to Stanford University. Instead of driving them to their destination, he drove them to a remote area, where he killed them both. Over the next year, 5 more young women would lose their lives to Ed Kemper, most of them college students, hitchhiking in the same area, trusting a stranger's car for a ride that should have taken 20 minutes. We're not going to walk through graphic details of each murder here, because that's not what this is about. What matters, from a psychological lens, is the pattern and what it reveals. Forensic psychologists who studied Kemper's case pointed to something important. His victims were almost always young women around college age, roughly the age he might have been dating if his life had gone differently. Many experts believe his violence was deeply connected to the powerlessness he felt around his mother, and that he was, in a horrifying way, redirecting that rage onto substitute targets, because he could not act on it against the person who caused it. This is a recognized concept in forensic psychology called displacement, when a person cannot express anger toward the actual source of their pain, often because that source holds power over them, so the emotion gets transferred onto a safer or more accessible target. In Kemper's own later interviews with FBI profilers, he was disturbingly self-aware about this. He described feeling a kind of two-sided pull during his encounters, part of him wanting normal human connection, and part of him consumed by rage and a need for control that had built up since childhood. What made Ed Kemper especially chilling, and what makes him such an important case study even now, is that he wasn't isolated or visibly off to the people around him during this period. He was known to some local police officers, who he'd occasionally have friendly conversations with at a bar near campus. Some of those same officers were actively investigating the very murders he was committing. He didn't fit the stereotype people expect from a killer. He was well-spoken, self-deprecating, even funny in social settings. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire case. Dangerous behavior does not always come with visible warning signs to the people nearby. Kemper himself later said he was stunned that no one suspected him, given how big and physically imposing he was. This is why forensic psychologists often warn against relying on gut feeling or appearance alone to judge threat. Behavior patterns, not first impressions, are what investigators are trained to look for, and even then, as this case shows, it can take a long time to see the full picture. While all of this was happening, Ed's relationship with his mother continued to deteriorate. Clarnell reportedly mocked him in front of others, called him names, and continued the same pattern of control and belittlement that had defined their relationship since he was a child. Investigators and psychologists who later studied the case believe this ongoing conflict functioned almost like a pressure valve that never got released, until eventually it did, in the most horrifying way possible. By early 1973, Ed Kemper had murdered 6 young women, and the person he says he was truly angry at his entire life had still not faced any consequences. That was about to change. By early 1973, Ed Kemper had already killed 6 young women across Santa Cruz, California, all while living a quiet double life, occasionally chatting with the very police officers investigating his crimes. But the person whose approval he had chased his entire life, and whose control had shaped almost every part of who he became, was still at home, waiting for him every night. That was about to change, and what happened next would end his killing spree for good. But not before one final, devastating act. On the night of April 20th, 1973, Ed Kemper entered his mother's bedroom while she slept and killed her. It was the act that, in many ways, everything before it had been building toward: the person he could never fully please, never fully escape, and never fully confront while she was alive. The next day, he invited one of his mother's close friends over to the house. He killed her as well. Then, Ed Kemper did something almost no one expected. He didn't run. He didn't hide. Instead, he got in his car and started driving east, away from California, with no clear plan. Somewhere along the highway, driving through the night, Ed Kemper made a decision that would define how the entire world understood him. He stopped at a payphone in Pueblo, Colorado, and called the Santa Cruz Police Department. At first, the officer who answered didn't believe him. Kemper had to call back multiple times, giving specific details only the real killer could know. Before they realized this wasn't a prank call, he told them exactly where he was. He waited for them to come get him. He didn't put up any resistance. When asked why, he confessed. Kemper's answer was, in its own way, deeply revealing. He said he was tired of running from what he had done, and tired, on some level, of himself. What happened after his arrest is one of the most studied parts of this entire case. Ed Kemper did not fight the charges. He did not try to minimize what he'd done. Instead, he gave police and prosecutors an extraordinarily detailed, methodical account of every single murder, dates, locations, and decisions he made along the way. This level of detail and cooperation is genuinely rare in cases like this. Most offenders, even after being caught, minimize, deny, or blame others. Kemper did the opposite. He seemed to want to be understood, almost as much as he wanted to be punished. During his trial in 1973, he was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists. Some found him legally sane at the time of the murders, meaning he understood what he was doing was wrong, and was capable of controlling his actions, but chose not to. Others pointed to his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and complicated family history as mitigating factors. Ultimately, the jury found him legally sane, and he was convicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Kemper reportedly asked for the death penalty himself. At the time, California's death penalty was suspended following a state Supreme Court ruling, so instead he received life in prison, with the possibility of parole, a possibility he has been denied every single time it's come up. This is where Ed Kemper becomes such a uniquely important case for psychologists and criminologists, separate from the murders themselves. After his conviction, Kemper voluntarily agreed to be interviewed extensively by the FBI's newly formed Behavioral Science Unit, the same unit that would go on to essentially invent the modern practice of criminal profiling. Agents like Robert Ressler and John Douglas, whose work later inspired the show Mindhunter, spent hours interviewing Kemper inside prison. What made these interviews so valuable was Kemper's rare combination of high intelligence, verbal ability, and willingness to reflect honestly on his own thoughts and motivations. Most violent offenders either can't or won't articulate what was going through their mind. Kemper could, and did, in extraordinary detail. He described the buildup of tension before each murder. He described the specific triggers tied closely to memories of rejection and humiliation from his mother. He described the split between the part of him that wanted normal connection with others, and the part of him driven by rage and a need for total control, a control he never had as a child. The interviews with Ed Kemper directly shaped how the FBI approached future criminal profiling. Agents used his insights to build frameworks for understanding organized versus disorganized offenders, the role of early childhood trauma in violent behavior, and how offenders select and interact with victims. In other words, Ed Kemper, one of the most disturbing killers in American history, became involuntarily and voluntarily at the same time one of the most important sources of information used to catch other killers in the decades that followed. This is genuinely one of the strangest and most important parts of the case. His crimes caused unimaginable pain to the families of his victims, and at the same time, the psychological insight gained from studying him has been used, directly and indirectly, to help protect other potential victims ever since. Ed Kemper killed his grandparents at 15, murdered 6 young women and his own mother by age 24, and then became one of the most important voluntary sources of information the FBI ever used to understand violent crime. Now, let's actually break down what psychologists and criminologists say happened inside his mind, and why this case still matters today. When experts study Ed Kemper's case, they typically point to a combination of factors, rather than one single cause. This is important, because true crime content often oversimplifies cases like this into "he was just born evil." The reality is almost always more complicated, and understanding that complexity is what actually helps prevent future violence. Factor 1. Severe early attachment trauma. From a very young age, Kemper experienced rejection, isolation, and inconsistent caregiving from his mother. Attachment theory, a well-established area of psychology, tells us that a child's early relationship with their primary caregiver shapes how they understand trust, safety, and emotional connection for the rest of their life. When that relationship is defined by fear and rejection instead of safety, it can severely disrupt a child's ability to form healthy emotional bonds later on. Factor 2. Chronic humiliation and powerlessness. Throughout his childhood and into adulthood, Kemper was repeatedly put in situations where he had no control, locked in a basement, sent away from his family, mocked by his mother in front of others. Psychologists often point to a buildup of powerlessness as a major risk factor in cases of extreme violence, particularly when that powerlessness cannot be safely expressed or addressed. Factor 3. Fantasy as a coping mechanism. Like many offenders in similar cases, Kemper described developing violent fantasies from a young age as a way of mentally coping with his environment. Over time, these fantasies became more detailed and more central to his thinking, a pattern psychologists refer to when discussing the progression from thought to action in violent offenders. Factor 4. High intelligence combined with low empathy. Kemper's high IQ meant he was extremely capable of planning, self-reflection, and controlling his outward behavior, which is part of why he was able to avoid detection for so long. But this intelligence existed alongside a significant deficit in empathy, likely shaped by his early trauma, which meant his ability to plan was never balanced by an internal sense of restraint tied to other people's suffering. It's important to be clear about something here. Understanding why someone became violent is not the same as excusing what they did. Millions of people experience difficult childhoods, rejection, and trauma, and the overwhelming majority never hurt anyone. Ed Kemper made choices repeatedly over the course of a year to kill real people who had futures, families, and their own lives ahead of them. What psychology offers isn't an excuse, it's a framework for prevention. Understanding these patterns is how professionals today are better able to identify children at serious risk, intervene earlier, and potentially prevent a similar trajectory before it turns deadly. Ed Kemper's interviews with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit remain some of the most referenced material in the history of criminal psychology. His unusually detailed, self-aware descriptions of his own thought process gave investigators a rare window into how certain violent offenders think, plan, and select victims. This directly contributed to the development of offender profiling techniques still used by law enforcement today, helping investigators narrow down suspects in unsolved cases by analyzing behavioral patterns, not just physical evidence. In a strange and uncomfortable way, some of the very darkness Ed Kemper caused has been used, ever since, as a tool to help protect others. Ed Kemper remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. He has been denied parole multiple times and has stated publicly that he does not believe he should ever be released. In interviews conducted decades after his crimes, he has continued to speak candidly about his past, contributing further to psychological and criminological research. So why does a case like this matter, beyond simply being disturbing? Because Ed Kemper's story is one of the clearest real-world examples of how early trauma, unresolved emotional pain, and a lack of intervention can compound over years into something catastrophic. It's a case that both criminologists and child psychologists still study today, not to sensationalize violence, but to better understand it and to catch warning signs earlier in other children who may be silently struggling in similar ways. This video was made purely for educational purposes, to explore the psychology behind real criminal behavior, using well-documented facts so that we can better understand how violence develops and hopefully how it can be prevented in the future. If you found this breakdown valuable, let me know in the comments which case you want covered next.